On the morning of December 24th, 1944, in a tiny Belgian farming village called Freyneux, a 20-something corporal named Jim Vance found himself alone in the commander's hatch of an American Sherman tank, with no lieutenant, no orders, and 4 German Panther tanks cresting a hill 300 yards in front of him. His officer had been called away to a meeting minutes earlier. There was no time to wait for him to return. Vance made a decision in the space of a few seconds that would decide whether his village held or fell on Christmas Eve. He swung his gun onto the nearest Panther, checked his range, and pulled the trigger himself. By the time the sun set over Freyneux that evening, 5 German Panther tanks lay burning in the snow. A Kampfgruppe of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich had been thrown back in disarray, and a hastily assembled American task force, outgunned, outnumbered, and defending a crossroads village most maps didn't even bother to name, had held. This is the story of the tank crews of Task Force Kane, and the corporal who fought a battle nobody expected him to fight, alone, on the coldest Christmas Eve of his life. What happened in the next several minutes is a masterclass in exactly the kind of independent, split-second decision-making that separates a defended village from an overrun one. Vance swung his sight onto the oncoming Panthers as they crested the rise, completely unaware an American tank was waiting for them. At a range under 500 yards, he had one advantage that mattered more than armor thickness or gun caliber. The Germans were showing him their flanks, not their front. A Panther's side armor at roughly 40 to 45 millimeters was well within the killing range of Vance's 76 mm gun, even though the same tank's frontal plate could have shrugged off the same shot entirely. Vance settled his sight on the second tank in the German line and fired. The round tore through the Panther's thinner side armor and detonated its stored ammunition, setting off an internal fire that forced the crew to bail out within seconds. Without waiting to confirm the kill, Vance immediately shifted to the next target and fired again, and a second Panther burst into flame. 2 tanks, out of a platoon of 4, destroyed in the space of perhaps 30 seconds by a single corporal fighting alone with no officer present and no supporting fire yet engaged. By the 3rd week of December 1944, the German Ardennes offensive that would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge had already torn a jagged hole through the American front lines, and the fighting had settled into exactly the kind of grinding, village-by-village struggle that Hitler's planners had never accounted for. Every crossroads, every bridge, every cluster of stone farmhouses in the rolling hill country of eastern Belgium had become a choke point worth killing and dying for. Because in a region with so few usable roads, whoever controlled the intersections controlled how fast an armored column could move, and speed was the entire premise the German offensive had been built on. Around the small town of Mannheim, the American 3rd Armored Division found itself locked in repeated collisions with the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, one of the most experienced and feared armored formations in the entire Wehrmacht. Das Reich had fought across Poland, France, and 3 brutal years on the Eastern Front. Its Panther tanks, sloped and heavily armored, outgunned and outarmored the American M4 Sherman in nearly every head-on comparison that mattered. A Panther's frontal armor could shrug off hits from the standard American 75 mm gun entirely, and even the newer, more powerful 76 mm cannon carried by some Shermans struggled to penetrate a Panther's glacis plate at any reasonable combat range. On paper, an American tank crew facing a Panther head-on was fighting from a position of serious, sometimes fatal disadvantage. Task Force Kane, a combined arms unit named for its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Kane, had been thrown into the fight south of Mannheim with a mission to seize the village of Daschamps. It never reached its objective. A badly understrength company of paratroopers assigned to lead the attack ran into determined German resistance and was forced back to a pair of small villages, Freyneux and Le Mormesnil, where the task force's Sherman and Stuart tanks dug in to hold what ground they had left. It was not the victory anyone had planned for, but it put a dozen Sherman tanks and a handful of light Stuarts, backed by barely 45 dismounted reconnaissance troops, directly in the path of a Kampfgruppe of SS Panthers that was about to come looking for exactly the kind of undefended flank Freyneux appeared to be. The men holding that line understood exactly how thin their position really was. Freyneux itself was barely a village in any conventional sense. A scattering of perhaps 42 stone buildings, home to roughly 130 people before the war, arranged around a small Catholic church and a handful of muddy roads that happened, by accident of geography, to converge at exactly the spot the Germans needed to pass through on their way to a larger objective beyond. There was no reserve force waiting to reinforce the position if the line broke. There was no fallback line prepared behind it. The tank crews of Task Force Kane, spread thin across a village they had originally never intended to defend, were, in the most literal sense, the entire American presence standing between an SS Kampfgruppe and open road. If Freyneux fell, there would be nothing to slow the German advance until it reached a much larger, much more heavily defended objective further north. And by then, the cost of stopping it would be measured in far more than a handful of burned-out tanks in a snowy field. There was no secret weapon waiting in Freyneux on Christmas Eve morning. What there was instead was a defensive plan built around a fundamental miscalculation, one that would very nearly cost the Americans everything, and then, through nerve and quick thinking, would not. Major Robert Coughlin, left in command at Freyneux, had laid out his defenses to cover the eastern and southeastern approaches to the village, correctly reasoning that friendly paratroopers holding Le Mormonil to the west would provide early warning of any threat from that direction. 3 Sherman tanks from 3rd Platoon, D Company, 32nd Armored Regiment were positioned at the village's northeast end near the old stone church of St. Isidore. Among them, an M4A3 with a long-barreled 76 mm gun, designated D-31, commanded by 1st Lieutenant Charles Myers, with Corporal Jim Vance serving as his gunner. At dawn on December 24th, Coughlin called an officers' meeting. Myers left his tank to attend, leaving Vance alone in command of D-31, tucked into a hold-down position behind the cemetery stone wall, the tank's turret and gun barrel just clearing the top of the wall by a few inches. It was, in retrospect, one of the best defensive positions in the entire village, and Vance was about to need every inch of cover it offered. Roughly 2 miles away, an SS Kampfgruppe, built around Panther tanks of the 2nd Company, SS Panzer Regiment 2, was preparing its own attack, aimed not at Freyneux directly, but at the larger town of Oster beyond it. Freyneux was simply an obstacle to be cleared along the way, a village German commanders believed, based on incomplete reconnaissance, to be lightly defended or possibly empty entirely. 25-year-old Untersturmführer Fritz Langanke, a veteran SS tank commander credited with destroying 19 enemy tanks and wearing the Knight's Cross at his throat, led the lead platoon of 4 Panthers toward the village. Suspicious of what looked like mines on the main bridge into Freyneux, Langanke ordered his platoon to ford the river to the north instead, a decision that, without either side realizing it, sent his 4 Panthers directly into the unguarded northern approach to the village, completely outflanking the American defenses that had been built to face south and east. It is worth pausing on just how avoidable and how nearly disastrous that flanking maneuver was for the Americans. Coughlin's defensive plan was not careless. It was built on sound tactical logic. Cover the directions an attack was most likely to come from, and trust the paratroopers at Le Mormonil to provide warning from the west. Nobody had planned for a platoon of 50-ton German tanks to ford a narrow, ice-choked river most maps barely noted, nearly overturning in the process, simply to avoid a suspected minefield on the one bridge everyone assumed any attacker would have to use. It was the kind of decision that, in a different battle, might have gone unnoticed and unpunished. In Freyneux, it meant that when the alarm finally came, it came from precisely the direction nobody was watching, and it came fast. At almost the same moment, a runner sprinted up to D-31 and scrambled onto the turret, shouting to Vance that 4 enemy tanks were cresting the hill to his left front and would be visible within moments. Vance had no lieutenant to call the shot for him, no time to summon one, and no choice but to fight the tank himself. The remaining German tanks scrambled for cover, and Langanke, now down to 2 functioning Panthers from his original platoon of 4, pressed forward anyway rather than withdraw. Closing to point-blank range and destroying 2 more American Shermans in brutal, close-quarters exchanges, including one whose driver had to strip down to his underwear to squeeze through a jammed hatch and escape his burning, tank alive. It was, for several minutes, a battle that could have gone catastrophically against the defenders of Freyneux. It was Sergeant Reece Graham, commanding a 3rd Sherman D-32, positioned behind a stone wall near the village crossroads, who turned the tide decisively. Spotting a 2nd German tank company advancing along a distant road 2,000 yards away, unaware they were under observation, Graham calmly called out his own fire corrections without waiting for orders. Right front, range 2,000 fire, followed by up 2 fire. Walking his rounds onto target with the calm precision of a gunnery instructor rather than a young sergeant improvising a fire mission under combat stress. His second shot struck home, setting a Panther burning. Watching another German tank move to cover the wreck, Graham corrected again and destroyed that one too, killing the company's senior non-commissioned officer and scattering the remainder of the column into the tree line. 2 tank commanders, 2 crews, acting entirely on their own initiative because their officers were elsewhere, had between them destroyed or crippled the majority of an SS armored assault before the rest of Task Force Kane's defenders had even fully engaged. What makes Graham's contribution so remarkable is not simply that he hit his target. It is the method by which he found it. Graham was not manning a position built to watch that distant road at all. His sector faced a different threat entirely. He noticed the movement almost by accident, glancing up from the immediate fight in front of him at exactly the moment a second. Larger danger was crossing into view, completely unaware it had been spotted. There was no forward observer feeding him coordinates, no artillery liaison calling corrections on his behalf. He improvised a fire mission from inside a tank turret, using nothing but a stone wall for cover and his own eyes for a rangefinder, and put 2 rounds precisely where they needed to go against a target most gunners would never have been trained to engage without support. It is the kind of moment that rarely survives into official after-action summaries with the credit it deserves, because it looks, on paper, like a lucky shot. It was not luck. It was a sergeant doing exactly what years of American armored doctrine had quietly trained him to do. The instant leadership wasn't available to do it for him. The fighting at Freyneux did not end with those opening exchanges. SS infantry pressed forward into the village's outer buildings, briefly seizing several houses before American reconnaissance troops and a hastily summoned platoon of paratroopers, who sprinted 400 yards across open, fire-swept ground from neighboring Le Mormesnil to reinforce the position, fought them back out house by house. A German infantry officer named Erich Heller, trapped and wounded when American artillery collapsed the structure he was sheltering in, was pulled from the burning rubble by the very American soldiers whose position he had been trying to destroy and taken prisoner. Overhead, when the winter cloud cover finally broke that afternoon, American fighter bombers found the withdrawing German column and hammered it from the air, adding to a day that had already gone catastrophically wrong for the attackers. By evening, the German Kampfgruppe that had set out that morning confident of brushing aside a lightly defended village was ordered to withdraw entirely, its assault on Oster abandoned along with the rest of the day's objectives. The cost had been savage on both sides. The Americans lost 5 Shermans and 2 Stuart light tanks in the fighting, and reinforcements from a passing, unrelated American tank platoon were ambushed and destroyed later that same day by Langenki's surviving Panther, a bitter coda to an already brutal Christmas Eve. But the Germans had lost 5 Panthers outright, with several more damaged, against a force that had been outnumbered, outgunned, and caught by surprise on its unguarded flank. The strategic result mattered far beyond the wreckage scattered across a few snow-covered fields. The Kampfgruppe's failure to clear Freyneux stalled the entire push toward Oster and, by extension, toward the larger objective of Mannheim, buying the American 3rd Armored Division precious additional hours to reposition and reinforce along a critical sector of the shrinking Bulge perimeter. In a battle defined region by which side controlled which crossroads and which roads stayed open, the stand at Freyneux was one small, brutal data point in a much larger equation. And every hour the Germans lost trying and failing to clear that one village was an hour Allied reinforcements elsewhere along the line did not have to fight for. There is also a quieter, less quantifiable cost that the raw numbers of tanks lost and villages held do not fully capture. Fritz Langenkin, experienced and highly decorated tank commander who had entered that morning with 4 functioning Panthers under his direct command, left it with none. His platoon effectively destroyed within the first 30 seconds of contact before his crews had even fully understood they were under attack. For an SS officer with his combat record, that outcome represented something closer to a professional humiliation than a simple tactical setback, inflicted not by superior armor or superior numbers, but by a single American corporal who happened to have the better firing position and the nerve to use it without waiting for permission. That is precisely the kind of asymmetry, skill and initiative overcoming a real and significant equipment disadvantage, that shows up again and again in accounts of American armored fighting throughout the Ardennes campaign, and it is a large part of why the Battle of the Bulge, despite its early German successes, ultimately became the graveyard of Hitler's last major armored reserve in the West. There is a particular kind of courage that never makes it into a citation, because it doesn't look like a single dramatic act. It looks like a young corporal, alone in a turret on Christmas Eve morning, doing the math on his own because there was no one else left to do it for him. Jim Vance did not wait for Lieutenant Myers to sprint back from that officer's call. He did not radio for permission. He identified the threat, calculated the shot, and fired twice in the span of half a minute, because 2 burning Panther tanks in the next 30 seconds mattered more than the chain of command catching up to the moment. That is the story German after-action accounts from the Ardennes return to again and again without ever quite finding the language for it. An American tank corps that, ship for ship and tank for tank, was frequently outgunned on paper, but that had built into every crew, at every rank, a willingness to make the decision alone when the decision could not wait. Fritz Langenke, the decorated SS veteran of 19 tank kills who led that morning's attack, would later describe the fighting at Freyneux in terms that carried the unmistakable respect of one professional soldier assessing another. A defense that should not have held, mounted by tank crews who fought like they already knew exactly what they were supposed to do the moment their officers weren't prepared to tell them. It is worth remembering, too, that none of the men involved in the fight for Freyneux thought of themselves as heroes while it was happening. Jim Vance later described the day in the plain, unadorned language of a soldier simply doing his job under difficult circumstances. Checking his sight picture, tracking his targets, reacting to what the moment demanded. Reece Graham, recalling his own fire mission years afterward, spoke less about bravery than about the mechanics of the shot itself. The correction he called out, the round he watched land. That plainness is, in its own way, the most telling detail of the entire engagement. These were not men performing for a citation or a camera. They were tank crews solving an immediate, life-or-death problem with the tools and training they had in the only window of time they were given to solve it, and then moving on to the next threat because the battle had not stopped to let them reflect on what they had just done. Freyneux does not appear on many maps of the Battle of the Bulge today. It was never Bastogne, never Saint. Vith, never one of the names that made it into the history books taught in American classrooms. But on Christmas Eve of 1944, in a village of 42 buildings and a single stone church, a handful of American tank crews, a corporal without his lieutenant, sergeant calling his own fire missions, men fighting from a village most of the war would forget, held a crossroads that mattered more than its size ever suggested, and went home that Christmas having earned, in the truest sense, every foot of ground they refused to give up.
Consider, for a moment, what the alternative would have looked like. Had Jim Vance hesitated even a few seconds longer, waiting for a lieutenant who was still 200 yards away in a farmhouse meeting, 4 undamaged Panthers would have closed to point-blank range against defenders who did not yet know they were under attack from the north at all. Had Reece Graham kept his gunner's sights fixed only on the threat directly in front of him, a second German tank company would have crossed into the village entirely unopposed, doubling the attacking force at the exact moment the American defense was already stretched thinnest. Neither man had the luxury of knowing, in the moment, that his individual decision would end up mattering as much as it did. They simply did the job in front of them, as fast and as precisely as training and instinct allowed, and let the consequences sort themselves out afterward. That is, in the end, the simplest and most accurate way to describe what held Freyneux on Christmas Eve of 1944. Not a plan, not a stroke of luck, but a handful of men who refused to wait for someone else to make the call.